COVID-19 may have started as a health crisis, but the economic crisis is far more far-reaching and catastrophic than any downturn since the Great Depression. Massive government spending may mitigate short-term impacts, but in order to kickstart our economy, we need some serious reforms. Firstly, education reform. The acceleration of the digitalisation of jobs caused from COVID-19 will ensure that almost every single job in the Australian market has been impacted. We need our education sector to adapt fast to this new reality. Our teachers and school curriculums will need to refocus. We should be teaching business skills and entrepreneurship to our kids. Workers will have to reskill without the need to stop working, and urgent reforms are needed for post-secondary education and skill systems. The cultural and funding bias against vocational education needs to be eliminated by moving to a single funding model for both vet and higher education. Secondly, economic reform. Economic reform should focus on eliminating burdensome regulation, increasing competition and generating real wages growth for workers. Now, there's going to be a massive debt to be cleared post-corona, but we must still ensure that our company and personal tax rates are internationally competitive. Governments must make it easy, cheap and straightforward to establish a business. For the bureaucrats watching, it isn't at the moment. With Australia's current red tape burden being estimated at 11% of GDP, regulation must be reduced. Constraints should be placed on introducing new regulation at all levels of government. And government itself needs to become far more efficient and focused on service delivery. And competition, finally, needs to be delivered in the banking and finance sector. The final area of reform is that of the environment. The Federal Environmental Act needs to be amended to ensure that the environment is protected, but projects can achieve approvals within reasonable timeframes. And a national energy policy needs to be agreed via our newfound bipartisanship, with the prime objective being reliable and affordable energy. Well, what do you make about all that, Catherine?
I think we've got to, you know, they always say the cliche, don't waste a crisis, and I think we've got to take a really good hard look at duplication in government. You know, the burden of this crisis thus far is being felt inordinately by the private sector and the young, especially casual workers from hospitality and tourism. I think your emphasis on vocational education is correct. There are too many fat second-rate universities in Australia that have got fat on bloated fees from foreign students, and some of those, if they don't survive this crisis, I think will go unmourned. I would also look at maybe adopting what Boris Johnson had done with the BBC in the United Kingdom, and have a look on the other side of this of whether we don't look at just a licence fee for those who wish to consume the ABC, because a lot of media organisations dependent on advertising revenue are taking a haircut, and they're sitting over there fat, dumb and happy riding the crisis out, business as usual. So I'm in pretty violent agreement with you on a lot of things. One thing I would close on, though, and we're both ex-army, during the Great Depression, defence expenditure was cut to the quick, as you know, and we ended up in a world war off the back of that depression. I would be looking very hardly at that submarine program as whether that bottomless pit of expenditure into industrial welfare for South Australia is the best way to spend our defence dollar, but agree with a lot of what you're saying, and reduction of government red tape, yes, here.
What do you make of that, Antoinette? Is he right on the defence spending?
Oh, I'd just like to take a step back, and this must be a record, only a couple of minutes in, Catherine, before there's a swipe at the ABC. Look, to be fair, the ABC has been dealing with budget cuts for 3 successive years and outputting so much more in the wake of the pandemic and bushfire crisis. So I just wanted to refute that quickly. But in terms of some of the tertiary education, economic reform you suggested, Campbell, I'm in agreement, and I think we're beginning to see hints of that. And I'm keen to get your perspective on the New South Wales government waiving fees for 21 TAFE courses online, and they're quite vocational, business and digital. And also the Federal Education Minister today announced sort of cut price short university, not so much degrees but graduate certificates, and again they're nursing and teaching, but also entrepreneurship and business. So Campbell, do you see these couple of things as a step in the right direction?
I certainly do see that as a step in the right direction, Antoinette, but I think there's a whole lot more that has to happen. I mean, TAFE in this country was broken prior to COVID-19, and we've got to deal with that. We've also got to deal with the fact that, you know, TAFE and vet sector has been a second-class sort of citizen to the whole university sector. I mean, you know, for 20 or 30 years we've been saying to kids, oh, you've got to go to uni. Well, hopefully we can dispense with that from now on.
That you made, but immediately.
Very happy to double down on what I said about the ABC as well. Why don't we have a rule for them that no executive there is paid more than the minister to whom they're responsible? People on $600,000 salaries, $900,000 salaries at that organisation, and they've got their paw out for more funding. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, hear, Catherine. But immediately for businesses, what they will be looking for is for customers to return in order to turn a profit. And that's why such a burden rests on the shoulders of the government right now, to make sure that the stimulus measures that are being put in place are able to see us through until these restrictions end. Hopefully life will return to normal, so that consumers will have confidence, that they will feel secure in their jobs to go out and spend, to consume once again. That is critical in order to see businesses flourish once more. But there will be sectors that will take longer to recover or will never recover as a result of coronavirus. And that's why, again, it's very important that government does support measures to create jobs in new sectors that our country really needs to rely on into the future. In particular, areas or something that really should have become clear through this pandemic situation is that our country needs to be self-sufficient, and we need to be able to have our own medicine production, our own production of medical equipment, of food, and something that I think we all need to take a look at now is whether domestic manufacturing should be reintroduced.
Well, Catherine, I think Karina's making a really good point there about onshoring. I think there's very strong sentiment around the community now for that to happen. But, you know, what do you think? I mean, how practical is that? I mean, and what does government have to do to actually get that stuff being manufactured back on Australian soil now?
Well, yeah, it's easier said than done, and I'm in sympathy with Karina's objectives on that. Our supply chain reliance has been exposed both in the area of pharmaceuticals particularly and certain critical supplies like ventilators, and it turns out that we were very reliant on China, and you saw some of the stuff moving offshore right at the height of the crisis. So Australian manufacturing was run down as a conscious act of policy. You know, once Hawke and Keating floated the dollar and the slashing of tariffs, which began under Gough Whitlam, by the way, a lot of these measures were implemented by Labor governments, and you've seen us enter the global economy, and we thought globalisation had sort of more upside than downside. I think there's a real reordering of the global system now where the nation state may re-emerge in that sort of Westphalian model where people are going to say, well, look, we're going to rely more on stuff being made at home where we employ our own. It'll be interesting to see how the global system does shake out over this, but certainly no argument with some limited support from government for critical supplies, for instance, things like ventilators and health supplies and pharmaceuticals. I think there's a very good case for that, and I think we need to have a really tough look through FIRB at the take-up of a lot of our agricultural supply chain by offshore buyers, notably Chinese.
I think it'd be interesting to see, I think the sentiment, and people would agree, we want to be self-sufficient. It's exposed our reliance on China. But we also, as consumers, quite like getting things more cheaply. And when the cost of a T-shirt is going to increase, it'd be interesting that these same people who make the argument, we need Australian jobs, we need manufacturing in Australia, where cars are perhaps more expensive when we do it, well, we know more expensive when we produce them ourselves. Clothing is more expensive when we produce them ourselves. Just how popular that sentiment's going to be.
Well, here's the thing.
Well, happy to agree with you on that, as long as you also agree that people want cheap electricity when you talk about zero emissions.
Well, look, that's one of the things I said, and I think that the key to this, though, is this whole thing about red tape and regulation and the cost of doing business. I mean, and I hope this is the good thing that comes out of this, in that people finally work out that if you want people to be entrepreneurs, you've got to actually create a playing field where it's easy to set up the company. You don't have constantly unions and politicians, and by the way, the coalition about it these days carrying on about, well, if you do the wrong thing, we're going to put you in jail. You know, let's get back to what a company was all about, which was an entity that was created to help manage risk. And let's make sure that the costs of doing business, the inputs that people have to deploy, are more economical. Because I think we can do a whole lot of things here, but we can't if we keep doing what we've been doing for the last 3 or 4 decades.
Well, in terms of addressing the enormous budget deficit that generations to come are going to grapple with, do you think, or in which areas, because I think tax changes are inevitable, but which areas do you think the coalition is likely to pursue in terms of making that much needed revenue back? I mean, any avenue they pursue is unpopular.
Well, I think they're going to end up having to increase taxes. That's a sad inevitability. I think that needs to be accompanied by a tightening of the belt in the public sector, which, despite all the constant stuff we hear about it, really hasn't happened. We've got a very bloated public sector in the country. But I, for one, who has always been against increasing taxes and new taxes, I think we're going to have to see, for example, the GST go up. I mean, this has to be paid for. We can't mount this huge debt. But having said that, the tax rates on personal endeavour, like the personal tax rates and the company tax rates, have to be lower, and it has to be a far more simple system, again, to encourage people to get up and get off the mat and actually have a go. That's the most important thing, and that will grow the economy, in my view.